That's not an Australian film. That's an Australian film. Good day, mates, and welcome to the Horror Movie Syllabus. My name's Professor Victor, and I'll be your host as we go through all of the essential, noteworthy, interesting, and downright notorious modern horror films. If you're new to this channel, I recommend you check out the introduction video. We've got a link to that in the description below, and it's going to explain to you what the Horror Movie Syllabus is all about. But in short, what we're going to do is look at a particular subgenre of horror and then look at 3 movies from that subgenre. Today we're talking about Australian horror films. And I gotta tell you, I love Australian horror films. I didn't really realize that Australian horror was really a thing until I made the syllabus. When I originally did the syllabus, the early drafts of it had foreign films as a subgenre by itself. And then I realized fairly early on that that was way too reductive because there's so many different foreign films from so many different regions that it needed to be fleshed out. So when I expanded the syllabus, I wound up taking foreign films and just basically picking different regions for foreign films from different regions. And one of them was Australian. And when I started looking into that, I was shocked to see just how many amazing horror movies have come out of Australia. It's astounding. Now, if you grew up in the 80s, like me, you may think of Australia primarily as, people saying crikey and putting shrimp on Barbies and wrestling crocodiles and other nonsense like that, because that's kind of what was sold to America about Australia in the 80s. And that's maybe a little unfortunate because it's so much more. There's so much more that Australia brings to the table, and you really see it in the Australian horror movies. Now, Australian cinema is a relatively new thing in terms of it being a thing. It really launches in the 1970s with what's called the Australian New Wave, or often sometimes referred to as Ausploitation films. And they're a bunch of movies that are made from Australia, from an Australian perspective, starring Australian actors. And it really became like this movement to showcase Australian cinema. And while the movement as a movement kind of ended probably after the 80s, or at least that's what, historians seem to kind of figure, the Australian film movement has really persisted and has become its own legitimate film industry, producing some incredibly quality films, both in and out of the horror genre. Australia makes great movies in general, but the Australian horror movies are fantastic. We've talked about a few of them already on the Horror Movie Syllabus, and we'll talk about the few more in other subgenres. So I already kind of cherry picked some that could have gone into this subgenre to use in other subgenres because there's so many quality ones. That said, we've got some great ones to look at today. So one thing to think about when watching Australian horror is that it tends to, by and large, be really intense. The movies don't hold back, and they have a certain intensity level that really works for me. I wouldn't say it's 100% across the board, but by and large, the vast majority of Australian horror is super intense in the best possible way. And it's probably why I've wound up really liking these movies, and hearing that a movie is Australian, a horror movie is Australian, is a huge selling point now, because I know to expect something really intense, that it's going to deliver something really nail-biting, or really gut-wrenching, or really just kind of get you inside. So that's like a seal of approval almost, that it's Australian, because I can count on that. And that's why today we're going to rank these movies, undergraduate, graduate, postgraduate, by their level of intensity. The postgraduate level being the most intense of the movies. But make no mistake, they are all very intense movies. Everything we talk about today, there's a level of intensity to it that is absolutely fantastic. So with that, let's go ahead and get into these movies. The first Australian horror movie we're talking about today, the undergraduate level selection, is Dead Calm. Dead Calm comes out in 1989 and stars MVP Sam Neill and Billy Zane and a young fresh-faced ingenue called Nicole Kidman, who is the queen of the horror movie syllabus, if we're being honest. We've talked about her so many times. If you haven't seen Dead Calm, the story is about a husband and wife who go out on a boat and come across a stranger who seems to be stranded with his boat sinking. And they help him on board. And it turns out he is not what he seems, and he's actually rather menacing and might be very, very dangerous. And we're going to go ahead and leave it off there in case you haven't seen this movie, because if you haven't seen this movie, you absolutely should see this movie. It's fantastic. As I mentioned, it stars Sam Neill, who somebody in the comments a while back, and I unfortunately don't remember who it was, brought up Sam Neill in the context of a different movie under a different subgenre, and about how great he was. And I agree, Sam Neill is great, but it hadn't dawned on me how many horror movies that he's been in and how great he is in all of them. And I had to start wondering, is Sam Neill a Scream King? He's really fantastic, and he's fantastic in this movie. Billy Zane, who many of you probably know from Titanic, but was in Twin Peaks, and that always gets him a seal of approval from Horror Movie Syllabus. Billy Zane is wonderful in this movie as the villain and the thread of the movie, but it's Nicole Kidman. Nicole Kidman, who, as I mentioned, was fairly fresh faced and new. Now, this wasn't her first movie. I think the honor of that goes to BMX Bandits. But this is the movie that got her the international success. This was the movie that made her a star. And with good reason. She is fantastic in this movie. I say this every time I talk about Nicole Kidman. I always talk about how fantastic she is, because she's always fantastic. And she does so much horror that it's weird that we don't talk about her as a scream queen on the level of Jamie Lee Curtis, because she really is. She's done just as much work and just as much quality work as Jamie Lee Curtis. So it's interesting that debate, that maybe that's a debate to have in another video. But Nicole Kidman bringing her game as she always does. Again, this is an early role for her, and there's just something about her, from her face, just the expressions on her face, to the acting, to everything that she's bringing to the table. She is absolutely standout here, and there's no surprise why she broke out as a star after seeing this movie, because she really is a standout part about it. The movie itself is great. It's really well directed. It's really well paced. It's got a wonderful sense of tension, because it's people trapped on a boat in the middle of the ocean. There's no place to go. So that setting lends itself to a really tense and taut thriller. And the way that the things unfold in this movie, again, I don't want to spoil things too much, it all unfolds in a very natural and somewhat believable way. And the movie goes into some places that I was kind of surprised that it went. The movie's a little darker than you might think. I don't want to spoil things, but it did some things in there that I was a little surprised that it did, and in a good way. This movie is surprisingly great. I don't feel like Dead Calm gets as much hype and praise as it should. It seems like when you run into somebody who's seen it and you mention, they go, "Oh yeah, I forgot about that movie," and it's great. People love it, but it doesn't have the same cachet. It doesn't get talked about in best of lists, and it doesn't really show up in people talking about classic 80s horror or anything like that. And I think maybe it's because it doesn't really fit into some of the other subgenres as nicely and neatly. But it does fit into the Australian subgenre rather nicely. So here it is, leading off our exploration into the Australian subgenre. And it's a great first movie to check out. If you haven't seen Dead Calm, and there's probably a lot of you, especially younger folks, who probably haven't seen it, I would highly recommend it. It's really great. It's seeing three actors deliver excellent performances in a movie that is just really well paced, really, really fraught with tension, and really satisfying. So high recommend for Dead Calm. If you haven't seen it, definitely check it out and let us know what you think. The second movie that we're talking about today, the graduate level movie, is Lake Mungo. We're finally getting to Lake Mungo. I've mentioned this movie a couple times in previous subgenre videos, because I was saving it for this video and for this subgenre, even though you can fit it in a couple other subgenres really, really well, specifically the mockumentary subgenre. If you're not familiar with Lake Mungo, it came out in 2008, and it is a mockumentary style movie, kind of opining to be a documentary about a family whose daughter died in a drowning. and might be coming back as a ghost and trying to document the weird happenings that might be attributable to a supernatural presence, and the twists and turns it takes. And we'll stop right there because I definitely don't want to spoil this movie for you. It's definitely one that if you haven't seen, you should absolutely check out. Lake Mungo is exceptional. It is an exceptional horror movie and one that everybody who's seen it seems to absolutely revere. The movie never was a huge hit. It's one of the After Dark Horror Fest movies you saw in the packaging, and I've spoken before about how much I love the After Dark Horror Fest. Again, there's a horror film festival that used to happen that show various horror movies, and I never could go to the festival, but I did get all the movies on DVD, and that's how I saw Lake Mungo. Movie's incredible. And again, everybody who's seen it seems to love it, but not that many people seem to have seen it. It does seem over the years like it's gaining in popularity and gaining in notoriety, so it's getting more of a reputation. But it does kind of still seem to be like, if you know, you know. You know, a lot of people still aren't aware of it, and it needs to be shouted from the rooftops at how great this movie is. Now, again, it's mockumentary style, so fake documentary, and it could have very easily gone into our mockumentary video. But again, I wanted to save it for here because while it is one of the best mockumentary horror movies you will ever see, it's also, in my opinion, one of the best Australian horror movies you're going to ever see. So I kind of had to keep it here. It is extremely good. The performances across the board are excellent. It feels very, very real. The mockumentary format works extremely well here because everything feels very authentic. It really does feel like you are watching news reports and documentary footage, like you would see in any kind of like a true crime type thing or any kind of documentary like that, any kind of a 60-minute special or any kind of news report type thing like that. It's really, really authentic feeling, and that lends a lot to the effectiveness of this movie. This movie is very intense and very, very creepy, in part because it seems so real. It also has all these twists and turns in it, and you just do not know where this movie is going in the best possible way. It ratchets up the tension, and it really locks you in and doesn't let you go. It really grabs you and holds on to you, and it's super creepy. Like, it's a mockumentary, so imagine watching a documentary and feeling really, really creeped out. That's what this does to you. Again, if you didn't know that it was, a mockumentary, if you thought this was real, it would be incredibly unsettling. So, unfortunately, because if you're watching this, you know that it's not real. If you have friends that have never heard about this movie, try to convince them that it's a real documentary and see how effective it is. You might get like an early Blair Witch type experience from them. And I think that'd be pretty great because this movie feels so authentic, and it's a big part of why it's so effective. Like I said, the movie seems to have something of a cult following. People who've seen it really seem to love it. I have yet to see somebody who does not like this movie who's seen it. I know that, for example, I think Chris Stuckman is a huge fan of it, if you follow him. And it's with good reason why people are so devoted to this. I count myself among them. This is a movie that when I get an opportunity to tell people something to watch, this is one of the ones that I bring up. This is a great example of a movie that if you don't, if you know people who don't really like horror, this might be a movie that really gets them. Again, it is scary. It's not like, jump scare scary. It's not slasher scary. It's its own brand of unsettling scary, but it has its own version of intensity that really, really works. Extremely effective. I'm clearly very effusive about Lake Mungo. And I think I stand by it. I had a friend of mine watch it recently, and he was blown away by it. He really loved it. And he's a horror snob. He is not easily impressed by horror films, but he really, really loved Lake Mungo, and I expected that to be the case. I don't recommend things to him lightly because of his snobbery, but Lake Mungo stands the test, man. It really, really delivers. So take my effusiveness to be an endorsement of this movie. I let it take the Pepsi challenge with anybody. If you don't like Lake Mungo, if you've seen it, don't like it, explain it in the comments below. I'm not going to try to fight with you on that or anything like that. Disrespect you, of course. I'd just like to hear your take on that because, again, I've not met anybody who doesn't love it. It seems like it is very, very well received by everybody who sees it. So if you haven't seen it, what are you waiting for? Get on that movie, get watching it, and let us know how it goes because you're late to the game if you haven't seen Lake Mungo. And the last movie we're talking about today, our postgraduate level movie, is Wolf Creek. Wolf Creek came out in 2005, and I guess I kind of spoiled its inclusion here on the syllabus with my cold open, but it really is like the quintessential Australian horror movie. It's incredibly well known, incredibly remembered, and gets a reaction out of people one way or another. If you haven't seen the movie before, it's the story of a fictional serial killer named Mick Taylor who stalks the Australian outback for backpackers to fall victim to his torture and murder and all these horrible things that he likes to do to people. It's pretty gruesome, and we won't go into specifics or anything because again, I don't want to spoil movies, but it's pretty gruesome, and and that's where the reactions come in. People tend to really love this movie if they're gore hounds, if they like violent horror movies. This movie tends to resonate for the audience, and if you kind of are put off by that kind of stuff, this movie tends to be a bit of a rough watch for you. It's well known as one of the more intensely graphic and violent horror movies. Really kind of depraved, not like Serbian film depraved, but really kind of on the torture porn type of level of violence and depravity. So it's controversial in that sense, but for the most part, it's endured as something of a modern classic and definitely as an Australian classic. So you knew it was going to make this list. Part of why I think the movie is successful and popular is because of the performance of John Jarratt, who plays the killer Mick. He is absolutely fantastic. He's got a charisma to him that is probably on par with Robert Englund's Freddy Krueger. Really, he is that. I don't want to say charming because that's not quite the word I mean, but charismatic, watchable. Just there's something about him. His screen presence, the twinkle in his eye. Like he's just you love to hate him. Like he's a great villain, and John Jarratt crushes it in the performance, and it's a big part of what makes the character so iconic. Really, he is a slasher icon in the making. If he's not really one already, debatable whether or not he's risen to that level yet, but I think you can make a pretty good case for it. The movie itself is based on some actual murders of backpackers in Australia. It's not a true story per se, but it really is based on true story, and probably more accurately based on true story than many horror movies that use that trope, that kind of schlocky claim. Many of them kind of say it, but they aren't really. It's very loosely based on it. This is probably a little bit closer based on two different killers, two different series of killings in Australia. Again, did the research on it. It's kind of interesting, but the movie is its own beast. It's its own. Mick Taylor's his own character, and it's really quite fascinating. The story is. Not terribly deep. It really is more about the performances. Like you really put into the shoes of these backpackers who are being tormented and tortured, and it is bleak. It is dark. It is violent, and it's a rough watch. I'm not going to try to undersell that. If you're sensitive to that kind of violence, Wolf Creek may be a tough one for you to get through, and maybe isn't quite for you. But if you're able to roll with that, then I definitely think this is one you got to check out because, again, it's got a bit of an icon status to it, both in terms of the killer Mick and in terms of the movie itself, and as a representative of exploitation of modern Australian cinema, Australian horror cinema. This is a pinnacle movie. So definitely one to check out for sure if you haven't already. Now, there is a sequel to it, which is kind of more of the same. I wouldn't go as far as saying maybe diminishing returns, but it's a little bit more of the same. It's not bringing a whole lot new to the table. It's got a little bit of twist to it, but it's more of the same. Worth checking out. If you like the first one, I think you would like the second one as well. So I'll say that. It's also got a TV series based on it now, which I think is on Shudder, and I haven't checked that out yet. And I mean to, I just haven't had time to do it yet. I haven't heard one way or the other if it's any good. It seems like a weird premise for a TV show. It seems like it kind of get a little monotonous or repetitive. But I'm open to it. I'll check it out because I do like this movie quite a bit. I think it's really, really good. And I find it fun. I'm not bothered by the violence of it. So I'm really curious to see what the TV show could do with it. But if anything, check out the original. Again, if you have the stomach for it, if you have the constitution for it, check out the original because I do think it's a rather important Australian film, and I do think it's a very, very, very effective Australian horror film. So those are our three selections for the syllabus for the Australian horror movies, but we've got a few extra credit movies to talk about as well. Like I said, there's a lot of great Australian horror out there, so I've limited myself to just three movies to pick for extra credit, but they are three really good movies. The first one we're going to talk about is called The Loved Ones. And The Loved Ones came out in 2009, so it's a fairly modern movie. And if you're not familiar with it, it's the story of a girl who has a crush on a boy and wants him to ask her to the dance, and he doesn't because he likes a different girl. And so she and her father kidnap him and decide to throw their own version of the dance at her home. And I really probably shouldn't say any more than that because the movie is pretty insane and goes some places that I don't want to spoil it for you if you haven't checked it out. The movie was, I remember when it came out, and I didn't see it when it came out, I saw it later. And when it came out, I remember the advertising and everything made it kind of look like it was going to be a little bit of a campy fun. You know, it would show the scenes, you know, where the kid's tied up and he's at the dance at their house. And it looked like it was going to be kind of almost horror comedy, or at least kind of just like a really bizarre ride. And it is bizarre, don't get me wrong, but it is not campy fun, man, at all. I did not get what I was expecting when I saw this movie, and did not a complaint at all. I think the movie's fantastic, but it is playing it straight, and it is gruesome, and it is rough. The torture inflicted on this boy is shocking. It's you know it really could have gone into like the torture porn subgenre, but you know it's here in the Australian extra credit. But it's shocking how violent this movie is, and how demented the antagonists are in this movie. That's probably the thing that got me the most about this movie was how depraved and insane the villains are in this movie. It's really deeply disturbing, like, deeply disturbing. I mean, maybe not quite as disturbing as like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre antagonist, but kind of on that kind of level. That's the kind of tone and feeling that I was getting from this movie, and it kept reminding me of like the dinner scene from Texas Chainsaw, in a good way. Really shocking. Strong performances across the board really lend itself to making this movie as effective as it is, and some bizarre twists in the movie as well. Now, the movie does have a little bit of some flaws of like kind of running into explaining things a little bit too much, a little bit more exposition than maybe you would like to see in a movie like this. But it's a fantastic movie, man. It's a gut punch of a movie. It's really violent, really shocking, way more straight and serious and dark and horrific than I was expecting it to be. If you saw the trailer to this movie, you might think this movie is funner than it actually is. It's a good movie. It's a great movie actually, and a lot of fun if you like this kind of movie. But it's a rough ride. Even I thought it was a little bit of a rough ride. So you know, it's not a good time party with friends movie necessarily. It's a kick you in the gut kind of movie that definitely is worth your time. If you like this kind of movie, you gotta check out The Loved Ones. The next movie we're talking about is called The Snowtown Murders, and this movie is arguably more of a drama than a horror movie, but if you know the stuff that happens in this movie, you can see where it really does warrant being called a horror film. If you're not familiar with the movie, it's based on the very true story of a group of men who went on a killing spree in Australia and killed several people and stored them in barrels. So these crimes were often called the barrel murders, or the Snowtown barrel murders, because they were found in Snowtown in Australia. And so based on very real events that happened in Australia. So in Australia, this movie really resonates because the people are familiar with those crimes. Outside of Australia, I think they're not as well known, so this movie wasn't as big of a hit, but it's extremely effective. It's shot very like cinema verite style. It's very handheld, so you very much feel like you are involved in this storyline. The movie follows the kids of this woman who have been abused by this neighbor, and that all comes out fairly early in the movie. And then she gets involved with this other guy who winds up being kind of like stepdad to the children, and he has a lot of pent up anger about pedophilia and homosexuality and stuff like that, and he kind of starts indoctrinating the kids, and one of them in particular, it follows the oldest kid, or not the oldest, the second oldest, I think, kid, as he kind of falls under the spell of this guy and his friends, and kind of join them in plotting against these people that they want to exact their hate on. And it's really wildly uncomfortable. A very, very intense film. Again, partly because with that cinema verite style, with that handheld camera, you feel like you're there with them. You feel like you're there at their meetings, and you feel like you're right there in the room, experiencing this indoctrination and experiencing these crimes, really deeply unsettling, and knowing that they're very true. And it's very true to life. It's very accurate from what I understand based on the research I did. Just makes it that much more disturbing, that much more upsetting. And it really is upsetting. There's some animal violence in here that's really upsetting as well. We've talked about my love for animals in other videos, so be forewarned about that. There's a lot of stuff that can trigger you in this movie, but it's excellent. It's really, really a fantastic movie. The performances are very gritty and real, almost a little too real, to be honest with you. And right off the bat, it's going to make you extremely uncomfortable when they show you a little bit of the abuse that's happening. So it's not for the faint of heart, even though, like I said, it's really more of a drama. The horror aspects of it are few and far between, and a lot of stuff happens off camera, so there's not a lot of on-screen violence. But the bleak attitude about this movie, the hatred in some of the characters, and the indoctrination and the attitude being conveyed, and just like the hopelessness of the whole thing, it really will weigh down on you, man. Like, this movie is intense and just kind of pushes you down, weighs you down. It's incredibly effective. Like I said, this movie not for the weak of heart, not for everybody. If you have the stomach for it, if you have the constitution for it, it's a high recommend, because it's an incredibly well made movie, and I would say kind of an important movie in terms of shining a light on this incident, on this this spree of killings, but also on the driving force behind the killings, the prejudice that led to these killings, and the abuse that led to the susceptibility of people to be tied up into and get caught up into these crimes. Important stuff to be focused on, and I applaud this movie for kind of shining a bit of a light on that in a very real, visceral, and honest, unflinching way. This movie doesn't look away, and you'll have a hard time looking away as well, even though you'll want to when you watch it. So if you haven't seen it, check it out. Let us know what you think. And the last movie we're going to talk about today is called Picnic at Hanging Rock. And Picnic at Hanging Rock is based on the novel of the same name that tells the supposedly true, not really, story of a bunch of schoolgirls who go on a field trip to Hanging Rock, and they disappear, and one of their teachers disappears as well. And the ensuing mystery of what happened to these girls, and people searching for them and trying to figure out where they are, what happened to them. And the movie is a fascinating ride. Again, it's not the scariest of movies. It's really kind of almost more of a drama, but the unsettlingness, the creepiness, the intensity of what has happened to these girls, and the ensuing search for them is really it is intense. It really is it's a ride, man. It really gets to you. You will get drawn into this mystery pretty easily, and really want to know what happened, and really start freaking out at all the different notions of what could have happened, and what may have transpired, and the way your imagination will run away with you on this one is really, really great. Now, here's the thing about this movie. I don't want to spoil it, but I will. I feel like I kind of need to tell you this much. You're not going to find out what happened. And that might be a problem for you. This movie gets some mixed reviews. A lot of people really love this movie. It's very, very well known. In fact, the video version of this I have is a Criterion Collection version, and those of you that collect physical media know what that means. The movie is very well regarded. It's a shining example of Australian cinema, and it's right there at the height of that Australian New Wave that I was mentioning earlier. So I really wanted to mention it here. And it's expertly made. It's a wonderfully shot movie. It's beautifully shot. It's not going to satisfy everybody, though, because it's not going to pay off. And if you're one of those people that needs to have everything tied up in a bow, need to get all the answers at the end, that's not a judgment on you, but you're going to be disappointed in this movie, and there are people that are. And so that's where some of the mixed reviews come in, and some people just really don't feel satisfied by it. Worth noting, by the way, apparently the book had originally solved the mystery, answered the mystery, and then they wound up cutting that out before publishing it, which was the right idea because apparently that final chapter has been released separately. And while I've never read it, I have read what happens in it. Wildly disappointing. Had that been the ending of the movie, you would have been disappointed. The movie is effective because it never gives you that payoff, because your imagination runs wild about what happens to these girls and their teacher, and all the little tidbits and clues that come out along the way just give you all that more sense of dread and unsettling, that unsettling feeling of like something terrible happening. Really, really effective. There's also some other subplots going on in this movie that are kind of weird and strange. Now, I love that. It has a kind of a David Lynchian sensibility to it. It really, and I love me some David Lynch. We'll talk more about him in the future. But I really love that kind of like surreal aspect to it, where there's these characters that don't quite make sense, and like these subplots that don't quite fit into the movie exactly, and they don't exactly get completely resolved, but they add a lot of flavor to it and a lot of character to the movie in a way that's a lot of fun. And I really, really, really like this movie. Again, it feels like an art house film, an art house drama more than a horror film. The horror really comes from that unsettling feeling of not knowing what happened to these girls and the mystery surrounding it. And you're not going to get a lot of on-screen horror or anything like that, but it's an incredibly effective film. It's very, very well made. I can't praise it enough, and it's a very well-known and important movie in Australian horror cinema, or just Australian cinema in general. So I really wanted to mention it here. And it's a period piece, and I have no idea. It's set in 1900. I have no idea if they really captured that period piece setting well, but the fact that it's a period piece lends itself to that feeling that, well, maybe this is a true story. And again, it's not a true story, but it really has the feeling of one. That, wow, this would be a really great legend if it was a true story. And the author of the book was very coy about whether or not it was really based on a true story, but it's not. But it really is an effectively made movie. It's a work of art, really. It's really some master filmmaking. And I would implore you to check this one out and give it a chance. Again, don't go in expecting to get scared by it, but go in expecting a really quality, well-made movie, because I think you won't be disappointed in that regard. So that's going to do it for our exploration into Australian horror cinema. I, again, really, really, really love Australian horror. It's fantastic. You probably checked some of it out without even realizing it. But if you haven't really dove into Australian horror, definitely start with some of these movies that I've mentioned here because they are fantastic. And I bet you people in the comments are going to be dropping a few other Australian horror movies that are definitely worth your time. Some of which we might have already talked about in the syllabus, some of which we probably will talk about in the syllabus, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't put them in the comments for people to look at and check out, because this is as a subgenre that is rich with incredibly intense and expertly made wonderful movies. It's definitely a subgenre that I've grown to really love, right up there with like Korean horror. Just awesome movies. So I hope you guys wind up enjoying these as much as I do, because I just absolutely love them. So with that, we're going to go ahead and call it a video. Hope you guys enjoy some Australian movies during the week until we get back to next week's video. And until I see you then, class dismissed.